Chapter 31, Second Year. Sirius returns. Saturday, the 6th of January, 1973. Peter, James, and Remus arrived promptly at King's Cross to return to Hogwarts on the Saturday before term began. They all peered about, looking for their fourth, but Sirius was not there, and nor was Regulus. As the train pulled out of the platform, James went in search of someone to ask. He returned with his hands over his nose, where a large boil was beginning to form. "Narcissa said it's none of my business," he explained, sitting down heavily. "Maybe they're using the flu network," Peter guessed. "Maybe his mum didn't trust him to get on the train with us." "Maybe." James stared out of the window, rubbing his sore nose. Remus had never seen him so unhappy. James had been missing Sirius more than any of them, and had been so excited at the prospect of seeing him once they got to London. Remus and Peter tried their hardest to cheer him up, but it was as if he was missing his right arm. Before leaving, Mr. and Mrs. Potter said that they would see what they could do about having Remus to stay with them over summer too, and he thanked them profusely. It wasn't likely, though, so he didn't get his hopes up. Instead, he just tried to be grateful that he was returning to school for a few more months with his friends. Most of them, anyway. Sirius was nowhere to be found at dinner that evening, nor did he appear by the time they were getting ready for bed. James and Remus had brought his Christmas presents back for him, and piled them on top of his pillow, still wrapped in bright, shiny paper and ribbon. 3 of the packages were from a dromedary, and Remus knew that they were albums. Sirius had asked for anything and everything by David Bowie. Sunday, the 7th of January, 1973. On Sunday morning, the bed was still empty, and the 3 marauders sat around trying to distract themselves with homework. Remus had finished his, and took the opportunity to get started on his Christmas books, now that he could invoke his reading spell once more. James took to pacing the room, went to ask McGonagall where Sirius was. She didn't know, and even tried Narcissa a second time. She cursed him again. Finally, he went outside to do a few laps of the Quidditch pitch on his broom. Peter went too, with a box of biscuits to nibble on while he watched. Remus stayed indoors where it was warm, reading, or at least pretending to. Now that he was finally alone, he began thinking about the things Mr. Potter's friend Darius had said about his father, turning the new information over in his mind like a coin. His father was good at duelling. He'd never heard that before. Lyle Lupin had obviously had a temper too. This was a new piece of intelligence, and an odd thing to know, after so long not really knowing anything. For the first time, Remus considers that his bouts of rage might not have anything to do with his condition. And who was Greyback? The name alone made him feel hot and uncomfortable. He wished more than anything that James and Peter hadn't been there to hear it all. Remus sat by the window in the Gryffindor Tower, his book slack in his lap, staring into space and trying to make sense of a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces to. Occasionally he glanced out of the window to catch sight of James acting even more recklessly than usual. "What the hell is he playing at?" a voice squeaked over Remus's shoulder. It was Lily Evans. She was sipping a mug of tea, staring at James on his broom. "Nervous energy," Remus shrugged, not turning back to look at her. The light from the window would cast his face into sharp relief, and his scar, while no longer red and angry, was still very noticeable. "James Potter? Nervous?" Lily scoffed. "I had no idea he was capable of such complex emotions." "Oi!" Remus objected, still looking out of the window. "It's not been a great Christmas for him, okay?" Okay, I'm sorry. I know he's your friend." She always said that, right after she insulted one of the marauders. "How was your Christmas?" "Great, thanks. You?" "Brilliant." He could hear the grin in her own voice. "Mum and Dad finally let me get an owl." "Ah, terrific. What about you?" "Got some books." From the people you live with?" He finally looked at her, even more irritated. Why wouldn't she just get lost? "No, from my friends." "Oh, of course, yeah. Lily was consciously looking away at the space just to the left of Remus's head. He sighed heavily. Everyone was going to see it anyway. At least Lily was polite enough not to ask any rude questions. Remus went upstairs in the end, drew his bed curtains together, and settled into conjurer's cartography. The others eventually came up for bed too, speaking quietly, thinking he was asleep. The exercise had done nothing to calm James down. Remus could hear his rapid heartbeat and smell the cloying scent of anxiety. It was perhaps an hour after lights out that the door creaked open again. Sirius had returned. There was no mistaking his familiar footfall. Remus felt a wave of relief wash over him, a knot in his stomach that he hadn't realised was there, beginning to uncoil. James and Peter slept on as Sirius tried to keep his movements quiet, creeping into the room and over to his bed, quickly climbing in and drawing the curtains. Remus lay still, listening to Sirius lying still too. There was something different in his breathing. Eventually, curiosity got the better of him, and he got out of bed. Not wanting to intrude, Remus trod as close to Sirius's curtains as he dared, and whispered, "Sirius?" "James?" he replied eagerly. "Remus." "Oh." There was a moment's awkward silence. "I just want to sleep, Lupin. Speak tomorrow, okay?" "Okay." Remus padded back to his own bed and closed his eyes, feeling no less concerned. Monday, the 8th of January, 1973. The next morning, Sirius had already left before any of them woke up. His presents, still unopened, had been pushed to the end of his bed. His trunk had arrived at some point, and his broom was back on its shelf. James saved him a seat at breakfast, but he never turned up, and they didn't see him at all until their first lesson. "He wouldn't miss McGonagall," James said confidently, as they pressed towards the classroom. "He loves Transfiguration." When they entered the room, however, they were all in for a shock. There was another boy sitting in Sirius's seat. He was smallish and hunched over with pale, pointed features and big blue eyes. His hair was shorn close to his scalp, in the same way that matrons shaved Remus's head every summer. It looked darker than Remus's, though. "Who's that?" Peter whispered, a little bit too loudly. The boy turned to look at them. "Sirius?" James gaped. Sirius coloured slightly and looked straight ahead as if he hadn't seen them at all. James slid into the seat beside him. "What happened? Where have you been? What did she do to you?" Sirius shook his head. "Later," he murmured. The classroom had filled up now, and everyone seemed to be whispering behind their backs. Remus couldn't blame them. He couldn't stop staring either. It wasn't just the lack of hair, although that was incredibly disconcerting. Sirius just wasn't Sirius without his hair. He also had dark shadows under his eyes, and there was not a trace of humour on his lips. "All right, settle down, please." McGonagall entered the room. She glanced at Sirius. Her eyes widened for a millisecond as she recognised him, but she said nothing, addressing the class. "Your end-of-year exams begin in 3 months. Let's see who's been paying attention." McGonagall didn't call on Sirius once to answer a question, though it was usually the only way she could get him to pay attention. Nor did she bother any of the other marauders, who spent the entire lesson shooting worried looks at their friend. When Transfiguration ended, they packed up their things and followed Sirius hurriedly out the door. "What happened?" James asked, trying to keep up with Black's brisk clip. "I said later," Sirius returned. "Wait until break, okay?" "But what did she—" "I'm fine." The next lesson, History of Magic, was agony. James was beside himself and even resorted to passing notes to Sirius, who steadfastly ignored them. He sat stiffly, back straight, eyes on the board. For the first time in 2 years, Remus saw him actually reading his history text in class. Something was very wrong indeed. They couldn't get out of history fast enough. James grabbed Sirius's arm and practically marched him outside to the nearest courtyard, where they chased away a group of first-year girls who were doing handstands against a wall, skirts tucked into their knickers. It was icy cold out, though no snow had fallen yet. The sky was paper white, and a storm was on its way. Once the coast was clear, James stared Sirius down, eyes full of feeling, deep creases in his brow. What happened? Sirius sighed heavily. What's it look like? He gestured at his head. Remus had the peculiar feeling that neither of them cared that he and Peter were there, that this was between the two of them, like their nightly chats. Your mum did that. Well, I didn't do it to myself, did I? He snapped angrily. James didn't react, just kept looking at his friend. That was James's secret, Remus realised suddenly. He was always patient, and he never took anything personally. How else could you be best friends with someone like Sirius Black? Sirius was now rooting in his bag and pulled out his red Gryffindor hat, which had so far never been worn. He crammed it over his shorn head. Bloody freezing, he muttered. Dunno how you cope, Lupin. Remus shrugged and smiled, pleased to be acknowledged. Sirius leaned heavily against the wall, looking at his feet. They let me come back, he said quietly. They almost didn't. One wrong move, and they've promised to send me to Durmstrang. James and Peter gasped. Remus made a mental note to ask about it later. Sirius continued. Didn't get my voice back until Christmas dinner. Had to play my part for that. Everyone was there, all of the Sacred 28, except the Weasleys, obviously. Lucius Malfoy really bloody hates me now, but he had to be really nice to me and Reg. Slimy creep. Got away with wearing my Gryffindor tie until Mum noticed and vanished it. Then I may have set off a few dung bombs during the fourth course. Peter, Remus and James all winced collectively. That's why... the hair? James asked tentatively. Sirius looked up. She said seeing as the usual punishments weren't having any effect, she'd try something different. I tried to get Pomfrey to grow it back for me, but the old bitch said she wasn't a beautician. Thought I'd done it myself by accident or something. You could tell her, Remus started, feeling the need to defend the nurse. Sirius shook his head. Not worth it. Regulus? James asked suddenly. Is he back too? He sent us a note to let us know that you'd got home, but we never heard anything else. Sirius nodded. Yeah, he's back. Kept his hair, obviously. Dad sorted out a port key into Hogsmeade. He's still, a bit of a tosser, but he didn't choose to be a black either. He just plays the game better than I do. He looked past them all, his eyes wide and desperate. Remus felt an awful ache in his chest. I just wish, Sirius said, but nothing more. The bell rang, and then they had to get back to their lessons. Chapter 32, Second Year. Gryffindor versus Slytherin. Everyone in the school knew about Sirius's dramatic new look by the end of their first day back. James and Peter took to walking either side of him through the corridors like bodyguards, shooting glares at anyone who dared snigger or whisper as they passed. It doesn't look that bad, James assured him, watching Sirius stare at himself in the mirror. They were hiding in the empty second-floor girls' loos during lunch to avoid any more stares. James was lying, Remus thought to himself, and Sirius probably knew it. It looked really bad. He seemed so much smaller. Without the dark hair framing Sirius's face, his eyes appeared larger than ever, making him look young and anxious. The high cheekbones and sharp eyebrows stood out even more than ever, giving him a mean, gaunt sort of look. It was no wonder everyone stared. In fact, barely anyone glanced at Remus's newly scarred face because of the distraction. Still, Remus thought glumly, hair grew back. Sirius rubbed his head, still watching his reflection. Peter laughed nervously. You look like Lupin. James nodded, his eyes darting between the two of them. Yeah, you do a bit. Sirius looked at Remus, and for the first time since Christmas Eve, Remus saw him smile. That Sirius Black smile. Nothing could ever ruin that. Oh yeah, I think I see it, Sirius said, still rubbing his head. He reached out and pulled Remus into the mirror's frame so that they stood side by side, staring at each other. We could be brothers. Remus laughed too, despite himself. Sirius's real brother was waiting outside Gryffindor common room later that evening. He was sitting on the floor with his knees drawn up, staring into space. His hair was still long enough to touch his shoulders. His friend, Barty Crouch, was leaning against the opposite wall, looking bored. He had made a paper airplane and was directing it lazily up and down the hallway with his wand. Crouch and Regulus were as inseparable as James and Sirius. Barty was fair-haired and weedy, with a mean streak longer than Snape's. Remus already recognised him by his cruel, barking laugh alone. Regulus stood up smoothly as the marauders approached. Remus felt inside his pocket for his wand, just in case. "There you are," the younger boy said, a tremor of nervousness in his otherwise arrogant tone. His eyes kept flicking towards James. Barty's paper plane began circling around them. "What do you want?" Sirius asked. "Just seeing how you are." "No different from last night," Sirius shrugged. "I didn't see you at dinner." "Wasn't at dinner," Sirius replied unhelpfully. They'd sent Peter down to the kitchens to pinch some sandwiches and sat in one of Remus's hidden alcoves to eat. Remus was quite enjoying this game, avoiding the rest of the students, even the Gryffindors. Usually, James and Sirius would do everything in their power to be noticed. Remus much preferred flying under the radar. "Can I talk to you?" Remus addressed his older brother. Sirius spread his arms, as if giving Regulus the floor. Regulus rolled his eyes, irritated. He didn't have quite the same mouth as Sirius, Remus noticed. He had a weaker jaw, smaller lips. "I mean alone," he said, shooting looks at James, Peter and Remus. "No," Sirius said simply. Regulus sighed. He clearly knew Sirius too well to try and argue. Barty Crouch's paper plane began spinning faster over their heads. Peter was watching its progress anxiously. "Fine," Regulus said, folding his arms. "I just wanted to let you know that Mother and Father asked me and Narcissa to watch you and report back to them." Sirius made a noise of disgust. Regulus continued, not dropping his gaze. "And we're not going to. We're both staying out of it, okay?" "How noble of you," Sirius replied. James grinned. Regulus rolled his eyes again. "I'm telling you I'm not your enemy, idiot. Nor is Narcissa. You can do whatever you like. That's between you and our parents." "Good. Good." The two brothers continued to stare each other down. If it had been James, he'd have broken into a smile, slapped Sirius on the shoulder, and all would have been forgotten. But Regulus was clearly just as pig-headed as Sirius, and couldn't tell when to end a fight. "Ow!" Peter let out a yelp, like a whipped puppy, crouching down suddenly. Barty Crouch has obviously grown bored of the family drama, and had decided to dive-bomb the smallest of marauders with his sharp paper plane. Crouch was giggling meanly as the plane backed up and prepared for its second attack, when James pulled out his own wand. "Incendio," he said lazily, flicking his wrist in Crouch's direction. The plane, wings now alight, went soaring towards the first-year boy with frightening speed. Crouch let out a cry of anguish, covering his face with his arms as the flaming projectile flew straight for him, only to fizzle out mid-air, crumbling into a pile of ash and cinders inches from Crouch's nose. "Let's go," Regulus muttered to his friend, who had gone pale and was staring at James warily. They both set off towards the dungeons. "Narcissa said to tell you good luck for Saturday, Potter," Regulus threw over his shoulder as they turned a corner. James ignored him, following Sirius through the portrait hole. Once they were all in the common room, Remus asked, "What's Saturday?" "Quidditch match. Gryffindor versus Slytherin," James replied promptly. Ah, Remus was no good at keeping up with the Quidditch schedule. He only went to Gryffindor matches, and the last one had fallen on the day after the full moon, so he'd missed it anyway. He tended to tune out when the others started talking about tactics and league tables, burying his nose deeper into his book. "I hope you thrash 'em, mate," Sirius growled, throwing himself into the nearest armchair. "Plan to," James said jovially, sitting on the arm of the chair. "As long as she doesn't get the snitch too early, and Marlene's the best beater we've had in years, so—" James stopped short, realising what he'd said. He looked at Sirius. Sirius groaned and stood up. "I'm going to bed," he said. Saturday, the 13th of January, 1973. It had snowed overnight. If Hogwarts had been any normal school, Remus thought to himself grumpily, they would have called off the stupid match. But no, instead Gryffindor Common Room was buzzing with excitement, with talk of how these were the perfect flying conditions. Peter and Remus spent half the morning trying to cast long-lasting warming spells on James's kit. Sirius had done one of his early morning vanishing acts, and was nowhere to be seen. Adil Deshmak, the Gryffindor team captain, made the team eat together at breakfast, rather than with their friends. They all sat there looking pale and tired, eating uniform bowls of porridge and fruit, on Deshmak's orders. James was the only one in a good mood, even though they hadn't got the warming spell to work. "Where's Sirius?" Lily yawned, as she took a seat next to Remus, biting into a slice of heavily buttered toast. "Dunno," Remus yawned back, hugging his hot cup of tea as if his life depended on it. "Sulking somewhere, probably," Peter said bitterly. Remus gave him a sharp look. "What?" The blonde-haired boy frowned indignantly. "He calls me whiny all the time." "He'll be here," Remus said, ignoring Peter. "He wants to see us destroy the Slytherins." Even Lily grinned at this, despite her usual pleas for inter-house unity. Today she was decked out in red and gold from head to toe, just like everyone else. After breakfast, they walked out to the Quidditch pitch together. The Gryffindor quarter of the pitch was decked with red and gold flags and streamers, plus 4 large banners displaying the golden Gryffindor lion. Thankfully, someone had also cleared the snow from the benches. Lily and Peter wanted to get the best seats at the very top of the spectators' stand, and Remus was already shivering despite wearing 2 jumpers under his cloak. "Cold, Remus?" Lily glanced at him as he tried to blow hot air into his gloved hands. "Just a bit," he replied sarcastically, too bad-tempered to be polite. "Here!" Lily pulled out her wand and grabbed his wrists, pointing into his palm. "Calidum vestimenta." At once, a delightful warmth spread through his hands to the very tips of his frozen fingers. "How did you do that?" he asked. "We've been trying all morning." "I think it's in the enunciation," Lily shrugged. She quickly applied the same spell to Remus's cloak, then to Peter's. By the time this was done, the 2 Quidditch teams were gathering on the pitch, which had been cleared enough for them to make a path from the changing rooms at least. They stood in 2 neat rows, 1 scarlet, 1 emerald. James could easily make out a few of the players. James's unmistakable mop of jet black hair, Marlene's fluffy sandy blonde ponytail. He could also see Narcissa Black on the opposite team, tall and willowy, her platinum hair woven into 2 neat braids which reached all the way down her back. Still no Sirius. "Of course," Peter was blabbering to Lily. "We don't actually need to win this one. We just need to keep our points up. As long as we finish with at least 6 goals, then we stay at the top of the league. Black's a brilliant seeker, but Slytherin overall are pretty poor, especially when you look at James. Having him is like having 3 chasers in one." Lily was nodding along politely. People so seldom listened to Peter when it came to sport. Remus certainly didn't. He'd attempted to read Sirius's dog-eared copy of Quidditch Through the Ages, but nothing in it could help him make sense of the ridiculous point system. Madam Hooch blew her whistle below them, and the players mounted their brooms, squatting, ready for kick-off. Still no Sirius. Remus craned his neck, looking around the stands, but even with his excellent eyesight, he couldn't spot his friend anywhere. Surely Peter wasn't right. He couldn't be off sulking somewhere. They'd thought he was over his rejection from the Quidditch team. He'd been at every match that year to support James. Just because this particular match was against Slytherin. Madam Hooch blew her whistle again and released the snitch. The players shot into the air like red and green cannonballs. Still no Sirius. Peter and Lily were on their feet, cheering with everyone else. So Remus got up too and attempted to look involved in the game. James had possession of the quaffle within seconds of being in the air, and had it through the hoop in under a minute. The red crowds exploded with triumph, but were quickly overshadowed by a deafening noise that sounded like a thunderclap. Roar! What was that? Lily stared about, wide-eyed, along with everyone else. Even the players on the pitch looked startled. Remus looked up and saw that the lions in the Gryffindor banners above them appeared to have come to life, and were now prowling back and forth against the red material, growling and tossing their heads relentlessly. "Is that normal?" he asked, pointing. Lily and Peter shook their heads, speechless, as the enormous lions roared above them. Remus smiled suddenly. He recognised that magic, playful and a bit scary. "Look!" he pointed again. At the bottom of the spectator stands, nearest the ground, a young Gryffindor in bright red robes was also stalking back and forth, waving his wand like a conductor's baton. It was undoubtedly Sirius. Who else had that overconfident strut? But he was no longer bald, and had instead donned an enormous golden wig, like a lion's mane. Remus thought he could even see a gold tail dragging behind him from under his robes. Once everyone had seen him, the crowd laughed, even Ravenclaw and Hufflepuff. But Slytherin did not. The green-coloured portion of the crowd merely glared at the garish show of house pride. James was clearly not distracted by the new mascots, but instead encouraged by them, which must have been Sirius's intention. He scored at least 3 more goals, resulting in 3 more ear-splitting roars, while the Slytherin struggled to recover from the surprise. "We are Gryffindor!" Sirius was chanting, his voice magically amplified. "Mighty, mighty Gryffindor!" the crowd screamed back. Once he got used to all of the noise, Remus began to enjoy a Quidditch game for the first time. James was like a red blur on the pitch, darting this way and that, though the other chasers were very good too, managing to keep up with his complicated formations and passes. Marlene, bat in hand, was doing a stunning job of not only protecting the chasers and seeker, but aiming bludgers at the other team, Narcissa in particular. Narcissa Black, however, was in her own league. She had an elegant, smooth flying style that Remus recognised from Sirius's attempt to teach him formal flying. She was quick and always moving, like water. The Gryffindor seeker was following her movements, hoping she would lead him to the snitch. But she kept dodging and making false turns to confuse him, twice sending him directly into the path of a bludger. She wasn't showy like James. She was efficient and ruthless. Gryffindor had 100-point lead when Narcissa finally saw the snitch. Remus noticed the moment she finally caught sight of it. Her posture changed. She didn't look away even once. She hovered for a few moments, glancing behind her to see where the Gryffindor seeker was. He was hanging back, unsure what she was planning. At that very moment, Macy Jackson, one of the Gryffindor chasers, scored another goal, bringing Gryffindor's score up to 130 against Slytherin's 20. The Gryffindors went wild, and Sirius waved his wand even more enthusiastically. The lions not only roared this time, but leapt clear through the banners, out into the winter air, where they became strange golden shadows striding across the pitch. The Gryffindor seeker dived to dodge them, clearly terrified, though they vanished just above his head. "No, you idiot!" Sirius's voice echoed over the cheering. It was too late. Narcissa had taken advantage of her opponent's distraction and scooped up the snitch. She flew above the crowds, holding it aloft triumphantly. The Slytherin crowd finally burst into applause, sending up green and silver sparks, cheering, "Black! Black! Black!" Of course, this was highly confusing, as the Gryffindors were also chanting, "Black! Black! Black!" as Sirius took his bows before the crowd. James swooped down to land beside him and ruffled his friend's ridiculous mane as the crowd now chanted, "Potter! Potter! Potter!" "Oh well," Peter grinned up at Remus. "We lost, but we're still tied with Ravenclaw in the league table. Still going through to the final." Remus couldn't care less. Afterwards, they poured onto the pitch to congratulate their team. Remus and Peter both punched Sirius playfully. "You never told us!" We could have helped. Sirius just smirked and tossed his glorious golden hair. Sirius? A thin, cold voice broke through the crowd. They all turned. Narcissa was striding towards them, still in her billowing emerald robes, a bright silver medal hanging around her neck that made Remus shrink back behind Peter. Sirius stood to face her. She gave him an unexpected smirk. "Take off that obscene wig," she said sharply. He complied, rubbing his bare head self-consciously. Narcissa pulled out her wand with one sweeping motion and tapped his head. Cresari. The marauders, and the crowd of Gryffindors around them all gasped. Sirius's hair began to grow back, like black water tumbling from his head, until it was back to its usual length. "What the—" Sirius grabbed his head. Narcissa grinned, showing rows of pearly teeth. "That's for your help in ensuring a Slytherin victory." With that, she turned, silver plaits whipping around, and flounced off towards her own team. James tugged on Sirius's newly restored tresses. "I'm never going to understand your bonkers family, mate." Chapter 33, Second Year, Discoveries. After the landmark Gryffindor vs Slytherin game, it felt as though time was speeding up for Remus. Part of this was down to the balance having been restored in their dorm room. James was once again the hero. Sirius's rebellious streak was back in full flow. Peter was no longer treading on eggshells around either of them, and Remus had no peace and quiet at all, though could hardly complain about it. As if trying to make up for lost time, James and Sirius tore through the final weeks of winter with a renewed zest for pranks and mischief. They spent half of their time under the invisibility cloak, casting hexes at unsuspecting students in the halls, raiding the kitchens and causing upset in the dining hall. At least 3 or 4 nights a week they crept out together, with Remus's map to plot the castle, though most of the time they returned with armfuls of sweets from Honeydukes instead. Peter often tried to tag along, but Remus needed all the sleep he could get. His January and February full moons were not good, neither quite so bad as the December moon that had left him so obviously scarred, but neither were at all pleasant. Madame Pomfrey was relentless in her quest to find a solution. In January, she tried vanishing his fingernails. "Only temporarily, you understand. You'll have them back in the morning." But it did not stop his claws from growing in once the transformation took hold. Remus was somewhat relieved by this, as she'd had plans to vanish his teeth next. In February, she tried securing his arms and legs with magical manacles to stop him from hurting himself. She was extremely apologetic about these measures, even more so when she returned in the morning to find that he had dislocated both shoulders, breaking free of the shackles. He was too tired to care very much. While engaging in less pranks than he had the year before, Remus chose to throw himself into his studies. Secretly, Remus hoped to take advantage of Sirius and James's determination not to focus on their schoolwork. He wanted to come top in History of Magic again, and knew he had a good chance. Not just that, his marks had been getting better and better in Transfiguration, Herbology, and Astrology too, and he at least had the chance to be top in 3. Charms and potions still belonged to Lily Evans, but he wanted to close the gap between them as much as possible. As such, he finally overcame his fear of the library, and spent almost every free hour he had in there, completing essays and revising. His reading had improved a fair bit. He was still slow if he didn't use the spell, but he found that his constant practice helped him recognise the letters much faster than before. Lily was often in the library too, and after a few days of nodding politely to each other across the desks, Lily gathered up her things and came to sit next to him. They got along very well together, either reading quietly or querying each other on various points. Inevitably, Lily was the second person after Sirius to discover Remus's secret. "Why'd you do that?" she asked, looking at him. "Do what?" "Every time you open a new book, you put your hand on it and scratch your head with your wand." "No, I don't." Remus put his wand down guiltily. "Yes, you do," Lily said, calmly, a small smile playing on her lips. You muttered something too. Was it a spell? Oh, go on, tell me. Is it something to do with the books? Is it how you figure everything out quicker than me? Remus was so pleased by this compliment that he dropped his guard for once. Promise you won't tell anyone. Promise. It's to help me read. I find it harder than everyone else, reading the normal way. Wow, how does it work? Her eyes grew wider, as they always did when she was excited about something. Remus was surprised. She didn't seem at all interested to hear that he couldn't read normally. Like this. He showed her. She copied him, but looked disappointed. It didn't work. It's really hard to do, he explained. Took me ages to get it right. Where did you find out about it? That's really, really advanced stuff. I didn't. Sirius did. I don't think it's written down anywhere. It sounded more like he bunged a few different spells together. Probably why it's a bit clunky. Really? If Lily's eyes got any wider, then they were in danger of falling out of her head. I knew he was cleverer than he acts in lessons. Oh, that git. Show me again. As well as Lily, Remus often found that he was joined by her friends, Mary and Marlene. At first he was unsure about this arrangement. He usually tried to avoid the other girls in his year purely out of instinct. Plus, the two M's were generally to be found giggling at the back of class, or fawning over some wizard celebrity in the common room. However, he was pleasantly surprised to find that both girls took their studies just as seriously as he did, and in fact that their interest in wizard pop stars was hardly different from Sirius and James's obsession with their favourite Quidditch teams. Mary was particularly nice to talk to. She was Muggle-born and from South London. Her accent made Remus feel strangely at home. She was unpretentious and had a broad smile and a loud, infectious laugh. Marlene was slightly quieter, but hysterically funny and able to mimic almost anyone in the school, including the teachers. Her McGonagall was spectacular. Remus actually cried with laughter. The three girls were exceptionally kind to Remus, and he knew this was mostly because they thought he was ill. He didn't mind, though, because he was learning plenty of interesting things from them. For one, Mary had a spell for covering up blemishes, which didn't completely vanish his scars, but noticeably reduced their appearance. He'd even thought to look in a beauty magazine for a solution. They introduced him to various other girly things. Mary had a crush on Sirius, and Marlene on James. Remus thought they were both completely mad, and wondered if they'd feel the same if they had to share a bathroom with Potter and Black. In return, Remus helped them with history of magic, since he was apparently the only student in the whole school who found Professor Binns interesting. Marlene was excellent at astronomy, and showed him how to plot his constellations using some clever mnemonic devices. "You're so nice, Remus," Mary said, in her usual blunt manner one evening as they walked back to the common room together. "Marlene and Lily were proper scared of you in first year." "What?" Remus almost dropped his books in surprise. "Mary, don't be so rude," Marlene hissed. "You were pretty aggressive," Lily explained. "And James started telling everyone that you were really rough, that you were in a gang." Remus snorted with laughter. As they entered the common room, he quickly spied Sirius, James and Peter huddled in a corner, poring over a very large, very thick book. Marlene and Mary burst into fits of giggles when they saw them, and ran upstairs. Lily shared a knowing look with Remus before following them. The Marauders looked up as their friend approached, and Peter very conspicuously covered the book they were reading with some sheets of parchment. "All right, lads," Remus said, craning his neck. "What you doing?" "Nothing," James said brightly. "Where have you been?" "In the library," Sirius stated before Remus could even open his mouth. "With his fan club." Remus smirked. "Piss off, Black. I know when you're jealous." He had elected to not tell his friends that Marlene and Mary fancied them. Their egos might not be able to handle much more inflating. Anyway, he didn't want to change the subject. "Seriously, what are you hiding there?" All three looked at each other guiltily, and Remus felt a sting of hurt. They were all up to something without him. He ought to have known. He supposed it was only fair. He had refused to take part in any pranks for so long now that they didn't want to include him at all. "Your birthday!" Peter suddenly burst out. "It's coming up." "Yeah?" Remus scratched his head, thrown. "Next week." "We're planning a surprise," Peter said, grinning widely, clearly very pleased with himself. Remus did not miss James's look of annoyance, and he knew at once that Peter was lying. Fine, if they didn't want to tell him. "Oh, right," he swallowed, forcing a smile. "Well, you'd better not be planning to embarrass me like last year." "Oh no, never," Sirius grinned, standing up, gathering the book to his chest, title still hidden. "Are we the sort of friends that would want to embarrass you, Lupin?" "Yeah, you are," Remus nodded, slowly, narrowing his eyes. "No singing, no big parties, nothing that's going to—" "Get you in trouble, we know," James finished, standing up too. "Hey, why don't we invite your new friends, huh? Do as good to mix with the fairer sex, don't you think?" "Right," Sirius tossed his hair. "More like you want a chance to get Evans on her own." "How dare you?" James replied, cheeks slightly pinker than usual. "So, if you're not in a gang," Mary mused a few days later. They were checking each other's herbology essays, and Mary was the fastest reader, so she'd already finished. "Where'd you get all the cuts and bruises?" "Pet rabbit," Remus replied, still reading Marlene's essay. "Vicious temper." Lily grinned at him. "Oh yeah? I thought you lived in a home." "I do," he said coolly. "We're allowed pets." That was somewhat true. There had been goldfish, for a time, until the tank got overturned by one of the older boys in rage. "Oh, in a children's home?" Mary looked up. "Are you Muggle-born too?" "No," Marlene said promptly. "Lupin's a wizard name. Your dad?" She looked at him for confirmation. He nodded, unsettled. "Yeah, how did you know?" "I saw the name on a trophy." "A trophy?" "Yeah, can't remember what for. I think it was outside the Ravenclaw common room." "Oh, right." He had never so much as glanced at any of the trophies, except for the Quidditch Cup, which James stopped to pay homage to at least once a week. He was suddenly filled with an irrepressible urge to run all the way to the Ravenclaw corridor and drop the essay he was reading. Lily watched him. "Go, Remus," she said softly, taking the parchment from him. The other two girls were looking at him too, somewhat pityingly. They nodded. He practically leapt up. He wasn't sure exactly what he'd expected. He could barely read for a few moments. He was so out of breath from sprinting up the 3 flights of stairs. The case was mahogany and glass, regularly polished by Filch, or the house elves, he supposed. It was stuffed full of trophies and awards for 100 different achievements. Wizard chess champion, Tri-Wizard tournament victor, Drubal's best bubblegum blowing finalist. And there it was, a huge golden statuette depicting a wizard raising his wand in a silly-looking stance, as if he was serving a tennis ball. Lyle Lupin, Hogwarts dueling champion, 1946. He stared at it for a very long time, reading and rereading. He tried to think logically. This only confirmed things he already knew. His father was in Ravenclaw. McGonagall had told him that in his first year. He was good at duelling, exceptionally good apparently. Both Slughorn and drunken old Darius had told him that. Really, all this did was confirm that his father had been at Hogwarts. He had belonged at Hogwarts, had probably touched that very trophy. Remus pressed his fingers against the glass, as if he could break through and grasp it.